Hello and welcome to CourtGames, a Legend of the Five Rings podcast funded by the Legend of the Five Rings Discord Patreon.
This podcast will focus on the role-playing game stories and lore for Legend of the Five Rings.
I'm Korvar.
And I'm Kakita Kaori.
This week, we are going to be doing another one in our Interesting Environments series, and it's going to be marshes and swamps. However, we do have a certain amount of news.
Just a bit. We have new information regarding the Writ of the Wild. We know that it is due Q1 of 2022. It's about 150 pages long. I didn't check to see if that's much longer or shorter than the other ones.
Yeah.
It will have Naga in it. There's a Naga on the cover. There will also be a Celestial Realms and possibly other reprints of currently existing books also in 2022. From some notes from Agonies, they've had things pushed into 2022 due to publishing issues, but it looks like they plan for everything to have it all resolved during Q1. So,
And I keep having to remember that 2022 is a lot closer than I thought it was.
It's the future, man.
It's the future. We've also gotten from Agonies a new Daidoji Shin short story called Kasami and the Kitsuki Method, which is available on the Agonies website, and there'll be links in our show notes. And you can also find Legend of the Five Rings character sheets for Daidoji Shin and Hiromori Kasami, which is neat. They're started not as player characters, but as NPCs. I think we both kind of looked at the conflict ranks and went, really?
Conflict ranks are... They're good. They're good. They're beefy. They're supposed to be beefy, I think. I think Shin's Earth Ring is a little low. But otherwise, he might be a hair too tough.
It's all the carousing he does. Yeah, he's possibly not the best of health. It was a fun little story, and having the character sheets is kind of nice. So you should go check that out if you haven't already.
Talking about which, there's also a live stream on Friday, this upcoming Friday, which may be the same day that this becomes released for all I know. That is with the author Josh Reynolds, and I believe that it's going to be on Facebook. So you need to connect through the Agonies Facebook page to get to that. But we'll have a link to the tweet regarding that, and you can get there yourself.
Righto. So let's get started. That's the news that we've had.
Swamps and marshes.
Yes, swamps and marshes, interesting environments. So you're our expert on all things geographical. So why don't you, something like that, yeah.
Yeah, actually, I have a little bit more experience with this topic than you might think, because my master's thesis is on tidal marshes. So while I'll try and avoid technicalities, the experience of sinking to your hips into a tidal marsh and trying to crawl out on your belly to get out, and various experience like that, I am very, very familiar with. So it is something to subject a samurai in armor to that you might not consider, but
that can be quite, yeah.
It's quite interesting. I am one of the people who have, in fact, experienced what it's like to fall into quicksand. There are 4 different kinds of swamps and marshes, or wetlands, if you want to call this as a roll-up. There are bogs and fens. Bogs and fens are both generally freshwater areas, very nutrient poor, so they're not good for growing anything else. They'll generally grow grasses, or they'll have a lot of decaying plant matter in there because they're just not good for a lot of plants to be growing to use that plant matter up and recycle it into fresh plants. So those are the ones that are kind of smell bad. They're often peaty. and can be used for that. So those are bogs and fens.
Yeah, so they're the ones that tend to be really oxygen poor, aren't they? Because sometimes things get preserved in there because there's no oxygen for them to kind of rot away.
Right. And that's because they're very low nutrient areas. There are two kinds of marshes. There's a freshwater marsh, and as it says, freshwater, they tend to be a single monoculture of one kind of plant or just a couple kinds of plants, but they're very nutrient rich. Unlike what you might think, they do have grass ones, but the more interesting ones for your games would be a lotus marsh or iris marsh or skunk cabbage marsh, which are really neat environments, I think, to work with. And they're not uncommon in even Japan. They're small, but they're not uncommon. Then there are saltwater marshes, and saltwater marshes are in estuaries, river mouths, where it usually is only grasses that are resistant enough to the salt water. So they will be saltwater grasses, and they're often riddled with crabs and small tidal creatures. They are often underwater during high tide, but also an interesting environment. And they will be along the coast and parts of the coast. So those are two types of marshes. Again, these ones don't smell funky because they don't have decaying plant matter. They're live, functioning, full, happy ecosystems.
Yeah, so any dead plant matter gets eaten pretty quickly. So it's not there rotting away, yeah.
Right, it's just like soil. Swamps are a wetland where the primary plants growing are woody, are trees or bushes or some combination of them. They also tend to be one kind of plant, but they don't have to be. They can be cypress swamps, which are generally freshwater. And when you see the spooky swamp pictures with the red kind of irregular trunk trees growing up together, those are cypresses. Or mangrove swamps. Mangrove swamps are usually brackish water or salt water rather than pure fresh water.
They're the ones, because when I think of like a cypress type swamp, it's basically water and the kind of trees growing up out of it. But in the mangrove swamp, it's like literally the roots of the trees are exposed.
But they're growing out of the water too.
Yeah. But actually you can see the roots more, I think, in the mangrove swamp, yeah.
Right. Mangroves have a pale gray bark and very large roots that do come out of the water, where cypress, generally their roots are down below the water level, and they have this reddish bark with evergreen-like leaves on it. So if you want to see some pictures of marshes in Japan, Kushiro Marsh in Japan is a very famous state park that is available. Got some gorgeous pictures of it. They are known for their red-crowned cranes that live there. This marsh habitat is the ideal habitat for cranes. So, and they have wooden decks that you can walk out, or you can navigate these marshes by boat. For all of these wetlands, they vary, even in the same kind of wetland, as to how wet they are. So sometimes they're navigable by boat. Sometimes oftentimes they have many channels that are navigable by boat, even if they aren't just freely navigable by boat. Sometimes they're not. Sometimes it's just mud at the surface, and sometimes it's deep. And usually it varies depending on the weather and the tide, if they're tidal. So it doesn't stay one thing.
And you got to have places that are like inconveniently dry to go by boat, but inconveniently wet to go by any other method.
Right.
Yeah. So I presume that we most likely get the kind of the mangrove-y types. You'd expect to see those more on the mantis places, the islands of Silk and Spice, or Spice and Silk, whichever way around it is.
I
probably the most likely place you'd see that, but
I probably wouldn't put them on that. I would probably put mangrove in the crablands. They talk about mangrove as being in the Shinomen, which is not saltwater, but down there around Shinsei's Last Hope, things like that might be some places where you put mangrove swamps. More just because the Mantis Islands seem pretty straight up and down to me, so it doesn't seem like a good place to put a lot of mangrove. But, you do you. We don't have an exact location. But, they did say mangrove swamps in the Shinomen, which is kind of far away from the ocean. So, whatever works for you.
So they might be thinking trees with exposed roots rather than specifically mangroves. Maybe, I don't know. The Shinomen is a weird place anyway, so who knows what's going on. So there are a variety of animals that you tend to find in swamps that are very kind of iconic. They will see a fair amount. Fireflies and dragonflies are well known. You often see that in all the depictions, they're the ones that you see quite a lot. They're actually quite plentiful. Cranes, like similar to you got the red-crowned cranes in the Kushiro Marsh in Japan, but other cranes as well, especially presumably other wading birds as well. So they will be wading in the more fertile ones. I suspect not the bogs and fens because there's nothing to eat. But in the others, there's going to be fish. There's going to be things, so you'll see them wading around. The giant salamanders
in Japan
can be seen here and there.
So that's a cool thing from Japan. And they can get quite big, and they're neat.
They get quite big. Yeah. yeah. And fish, obviously, where there's water, if there's any kind of ecosystem at all, where there's water, you'll find fish, which is also what the cranes are after. And where you'll find fish, you may well find kingfishers sitting on the branches near the shore and diving into the water and looking very pretty.
Yeah, so we have this image in the West of marshes, of swamps and stuff as being like scary, inhospitable places, right? But this is pretty decent land to be converted to agriculture when your agriculture is rice farming. All right. And it's open and you have a broad view of the sky in these marsh environments as well. And in a land where forests are hostile and mountains are mysterious because you can't see around you, which is what most of Japan is. Much of Japan is. This is very up and down. It has this, especially historically. Marshland doesn't have this scary aspect in Japanese folktelling as much as forests and mountains would be. Does that make sense? So you're going to find a lot of gorgeous poetry about the vistas of a marsh. Right?
Yeah, it might depend on, because you get the ones that are deep in forests that are basically, it's like a forest only the floor's wet. That I suspect is going to be a different feel, but the actual wetlands, the wide open ones where you have the cranes and kingfishers and all that, they're going to see that as much more friendly, I suspect.
Right. And in Japan, and this is different from Rokugan, the forests are on the higher land and therefore are less likely to have these full, very big areas of full-on swamps, tree-filled wetlands. I'm not saying they don't have them, but they're small areas. And if they're in the middle of another forest, then of course, yes, the scary forest wins the draw. But it doesn't have some of the same implications, I guess, as we have in Europe As far as I can tell, the idea of a scary wetland is not as prevalent. You've got these areas that are very, very beautiful. What does that mean? Overall, marshland, as I said, is often going to be considered undeveloped or somewhat difficult to develop farmland. It's going to be quite wet. But rice paddies need wet, especially if it's freshwater. If it's saltwater, then it's actually pretty good foraging for crabs and shellfish. It's a good area for food in a saltwater marshy area. So these are not hostile environments. These are, as I said, plentiful environments.
I find myself wondering whether marshland, all the marshland that could be converted into growable land has been converted to growable land. And so the only stuff that's left is it's too wet, as in, because one of the parts of rice farming is actually restricting water at the right time. And if it's too wet and you can't do that, it's it's too much hassle. And so the only marshlands that's left is just too hard to develop. All the freshwater marshlands, I mean. And that's a completely different one to, we can't grow anything here. It's more, it's too much hassle. We might as well just forage here.
Mm-hmm. So Rokugan fluctuates a lot in population. All right. And bad things happen. And then lots of people die. Because of that, in my mind, Rokugan is filled with large areas that were populated, at various points in history, but aren't necessarily populated at this moment in history that your role-playing game is occurring. So this marshland area could have been developed, but then reverts back to marsh as the walls break down of the rice paddies, and now it's all marsh again because there is nobody to control it and maintain it, because that's what happens once this all is overgrown. The Uebe marshes in Cranelands, I think, is something very similar to that may have been populated, may have been converted, and then converted back. But we'll talk about in Rokugan a little bit later. However, and swampland is forest. It's a different kind of forest. It's small. It is harder to log than regular forest, but regular forest isn't getting a large amount of logging either. And that cypress, when they do it, is a really good wood. This is where you want your boats to come from. So the logging in swampland is, if it is available and not in the heart of the Sonoma or something, that's where everybody's going to be going for their boats and their wood, because cypress is really great wood for many purposes, many building purposes. So in my head, Scorpionlands has a lot of swampland just because they are in their strongholds mostly. Easier to dispose of the bodies, but we'll talk about that in a minute. That doesn't mean there's no industry, even if it's not developed. There's actually a fair bit. One of the industries found in swamps, or in marshes and swamps, is the growing rami. Rami is a natural plant that makes a thread or fiber that's very strong and gets stronger when wet, unlike rice fiber or something like that. So it is very much used for coarse cloth, baskets, and twine and fishing nets, that sort of thing. So rami thread is grown in swamps. Lotus swamps are eagerly foraged. Most of the lotus plant is edible and delicious, including the flower, the seeds, the root, the stem, and the leaf can all be used for cooking. And they also pickle very nicely, so you can make other foods. So you can, if you have a lotus marsh, you will be doing all things lotus and exporting it, because it'll all add to your goods that can be shared and eaten.
We've already talked about cypress wood, very durable, very valuable, good for boats, which I can only assume is because it grows in very wet conditions, so it's good with water. We talked a bit about bogs turning into peat, but in Britain, I certainly know peat is very often used for fuel. It's kind of sort of ish becoming coal in a way, but it can be burned for fuel if it's harvested carefully. But I don't know whether I haven't heard of anything like that happening in Japan, so I don't know if peat was it that sort of peat?
It's not that sort of peat, and that's hard for me to explain. I've been reading technical papers because, of course, I'm reading technical papers on the nature of Japanese peat. It doesn't work for fuel for this purpose, at least in Japan, it's very wet and just not the same. Not the same stuff, so it didn't work well as fuel. So Japan, you're working on charcoal in general, I think, which we've talked about already. There's a lot of foraging of shellfish. We don't think about shellfish as, when we think about shellfish in the modern day, we think about ocean shellfish like oysters and all kinds of things like that, scallops and stuff. However, there is a good, healthy consuming of freshwater snails, freshwater mollusks, and crawfish and stuff in these marsh ecosystems. And they're actually, easier to transport too. You want to keep them alive as well. So just because you are in the heart of lion lands or scorpion lands doesn't mean you're not eating shellfish. You're eating freshwater shellfish, and they're just as, shellfishy as you're eating freshwater snails and stuff. So, and that's fine. Toss them in the stir fryer. And as I said, these lands also can be converted to rice paddies. So as development of such an area will grow, parts of it will be converted to rice paddies.
Yeah. So looking at the kind of places that you would find the villages and occupied areas, if they're in a swamp or a marsh, then given that for most of them the water level can go up and go down, they're very likely to be on posts, won't be sat on the ground, which is actually true of Japanese houses in general, but very much more. These are houses on stilts, and there will be wooden walkways between the buildings, and there can be quite a complex arrangement. And the fact that they're not tied to being on the land means they can very often spread out into any kind of small lakes and things like that. And like literally, I'm going to go fishing, and you walk out to the veranda and chuck a line over the edge. And sometimes they're only accessible by boat. It's the only way to get to them. So they can end up very isolated. Yes, very, very isolated, quite defensible, which can lead to a whole bunch of interesting aspects which can show up in your game because they're so isolated. They can have some interesting ideas, and they do secret things and so on and so forth.
Now, that said, they're not as isolated as these remote mountain villages because, you can often have these kind of wetland villages be centers of commerce. It's just you're only going to be able to access them by boat. But that's okay. That's what boats are, if it's near a trade route, if it's trading like Lotus or anything like that, you can easily have this kind of free flow of commercial activity. It's just wet. So you could have them remote, or you could have them be a commercial agricultural hub, but still very defensible because it's only accessible by boat. Now, this is Rokugan, so supernatural things, that you might want in your games or might be relevant to swamps and marshes. As we said, these are not as spooky as forests or mountains in Japanese folklore in general. But they do tend to be somewhat supernaturally linked to ghosts, because lots of ghost stories happen around marshes, and a lot of bodies are easily dumped in marshes or swamps and not found again. So it's a good place for bad things to have happened. And there's a couple of very famous stories about people inviting a friend out for some fishing on the marsh, and the friend goes into the drink. There's been a terrible accident. And that's the root of more than one ghost story in Japan about what that might mean. That's probably helped by things like ghost lights or phosphorescence that happen over decaying plant matter, happen in marshes or swamps. So,
yeah, you can see how that kind of association would come about, wouldn't you?
Right. So you can have that in your stories. You can have the haunted marsh or haunted swamp because some bad action happened there.
Slightly more Rokugani aspects. We have swamp trolls, who are a variation of mountain trolls. So they will set up their lairs in, I presume, the more out of the way, in the middle of a forest type swamp is where you're going to find your swamp trolls. Whether they're tainted trolls or not is going to be, that could vary, I suspect.
Yeah. Go ahead. Sorry.
And also, when you're talking about swamps, especially mysterious swamps deep in the forest, you kind of have to talk about the naga, because their hatching grounds are known to be swamp or forest pools. And you'd also get any other water-associated yokai, so like kappa and such like. But especially in the Shinomen, when you talk about swamps, you're going to talk about naga. We will want to talk about naga in the future, but odds on they're going to be in Writ of the Wild, at least from what we can see. And we don't know how similar their background is to the AEG days. So we may have to wait until we know what's going on with that. But we would like to cover naga at some point. But they are associated with swamps.
Yeah, I just don't want to talk about them until we know how much they've changed, because we've only had them in
Let's
one
not jump the gun.
Yes. Let's see. In Rokugan, we have two wetlands areas described. We've got the Shadowlands marshes, they call it, swamp might be better, of the Shinomen Forest, which is an area of the Shinomen Forest that is corrupted by the Shadowlands tape. And it's described as a swamp of cypress and mangrove. This you kind of see in Trail of Shadows in the Crab Clan novella, but think a tainty area in the middle of a forest. And the specific cause of it being tainted there is not well known. That will be your icky dark marsh. There's also the Uebe marshes. And the Uebe marshes are a high grass marsh. And it's got farming and trees on the higher areas of land in the marsh. And it's the home of the Hiramori vassal family of the Daidoji. These high grass marshes, they're really big. If you look at the map of Rokugan. So this is a really big wetland. So think of it as areas of different kinds of freshwater marsh with a lot of these hummocky, drier hills in between, because you're not generally going to get a freshwater marsh area that's that big that hasn't been developed. So must be pretty wet, pretty hard to do. And
so that's where you'd find. Sorry, continue. Apologies. No, I was just going to move on to the next bit. You haven't finished, so you go.
So basically, with those are the two that have been described. As I said, I often like putting my scorpion villages in the art and stuff. They show them in marshes, so there's probably some swampland there in scorpion lands. And there can be little areas of wetland almost anywhere that's not on top of a hill. It doesn't take a huge area. It could be small, like 5 square miles is a big, it's a decent size marsh, but it's not map of Rokugan kind of.
Yes. Yeah. It might not show up in like if someone's writing down what you find in all of Rokugan, you might not mention this marsh, but it's still there. Or it can be if you want one. Yeah.
Exactly. So if you want to insert one in, it's okay to put one in the middle of Lion Lands or Unicorn Lands or wherever. Just try and think that maybe it should be nearer a river than farther away, on top of a mountain or something, and you're good. It's fine.
Yeah. So if we want to talk about mechanical considerations, what it is actually like in game terms to be in a swamp, generally they tend to be entangling terrain. Either it's knee-deep in water or you're knee-deep in mud, or if it's even a relatively dry, as in, your feet get wet, but no more. If there's loads of grass everywhere, that's still something you've got to haul yourself through. So that tends to be entangling terrain, which will tend to increase the target number of all move and movement actions by 2.
Mm-hmm. And you're just not going to get that far in a day. It takes much, much longer to move through one of these areas than if you were going on the roads, unless you're in a boat. But
even then, with the boat, it can depend on where the channels are.
Exactly. It's going to be twisty. So you're not going to be able to go straight. So if you have to go straight across a marsh, you think that it's going to be an hour to go like 500 yards. It's really, it really takes a long time to get across. We have this, you can have quicksand or quick mud is actually much more likely in a marsh. And if somebody goes down in quick mud, one way you can do it is it starts requiring a TN3 to get out of this area of quick mud and then have it go up to TN4, TN5 on each unsuccessful roll. And you're going to need assistance to get out. But then assistance needs a description of how people are trying to assist you to get out.
Specifically, how they're trying to assist you without themselves getting stuck. Because that's the trick.
But the harder it is to get, the harder you flail, the harder you just try to power out, the more embedded you get. So that's why you want this, maybe penalties on unsuccessful rolls until you have to do something else.
Possibly if you have actual skills, because if you know what you're doing, it's basically you fall flat and you don't try and pull yourself out as such, and there's a specific method. So maybe if you know that, but if you're not familiar, you just kind of, my foot's stuck. I will just haul my foot out. Wait, hang on. Oh, that didn't work. I'm not seeing those get her again.
At the very least, yeah. Forget where I get it in a marsh. Just don't even bother. You're not going to do it. Also, you might want to consider, if you've been trucking around in a marsh, raising TNs or creating a disadvantage for disadvantage filthy when trying to do social rolls when covered with mud or blood.
Well, yeah.
Because, it's really hard to take you seriously on social rolls of any kind when you're in such a condition.
In a very cleanliness-focused culture like Rokugan, being top to toe in filth, it's not a good look. Not a good look.
So that might be something you want to consider in your games for Battle 2. But especially if you're trying to wade through a marsh to get to someplace. you may need to take some steps on the other side.
So if people are running games where they're going into marshes, going to swamps, what kind of images could they bring up to give their players a sense of place and a sense of the atmosphere?
Of course. Well, I like the image of a large marsh that is filled with a monoculture of water irises or swamp cabbages. Irises have golden iris blossoms, and swamp cabbage has white flowers that look like basically calla lilies that just go for a large area in front of you, like beyond out of sight can be nothing but straight lilies or straight irises in the right season. They are beautiful to look at. It looks like a field of these flowers, but it's impossible to cross. It's all, underwater, except for these blossoms sticking out. So that's one image.
You could talk about wading through a lotus wetland in water past your waist with broad fat leaves and pink flowers swaying above you, cutting off the light of the sun like a giant umbrella as you try and make your way ducked below the flowers and the leaves.
It's a cool place to be walking through. You could be standing with your lovely umbrella, composing poetry on a boardwalk by a marsh of long grass at sunset, spotted with white cranes calling and dancing in the early evening while the fireflies begin to flash over the waters. Very, very good poetry moment.
Poling slowly through a cypress or mangrove swamp on a shallow draft boat until a clearing opens up in the middle of the swamp to reveal a wet, mossy village on stakes right out in the middle of this pool of water.
You could have being pushing through a swamp at night and smelling the decaying vegetation around you, and you see these foxfire lamps coolly glowing amid the trees, hinting at something creepy. So those are some images for you to roll into your campaigns and find reasons to put players there. Do you have some adventure hooks for us?
Yes. I think I'll take this one because this is the long one and I wrote it, so it's my own fault that it's so long. It's not that long, really, but... So basically, a local fishing village in a marsh, in one of those swampy areas, this wouldn't be one of the more isolated ones, but they're having difficulties. Their catches are low, there are strange smells coming from the waters, the water levels are rising and sinking unexpectedly, and they don't know what's going on, and so you have been tasked to go have a look. Turns out the local water kami has been imprisoned by a foolish fish spirit in a power struggle. The fish spirit has stolen the kami's amulet of power, but is incredibly stupid and incompetent, and that's what's causing the problems. So the characters are going to have to descend underwater into the water kami's court, where the fish spirit wears court robes from 300 years ago and speaks in pretentious formalities it barely understands. And given its power, it's got the amulet. The players are unlikely to be able to simply fight it, so they're likely going to have to fool the fish spirit into freeing the river kami, giving up its amulet, or some other cunning plan.
I love it. The characters can be searching for a rare plant that only grows deep in a marshy area near a simple village. However, actually, it's a secret shinobi trading village, and it's usually left very much alone for very good reasons. But your PCs are there, and maybe don't know those reasons. Or maybe only the Scorpion PC knows those reasons and is trying to keep the rest of the party alive.
We're just ordinary villagers. It's fine. No, you go look for your flower. I hope you find your flower really soon. Tra-la-la.
I love this idea of the Scorpion trying to run interference while these other clueless PCs have to...
He could just kill them. No!
stroll through acting like normal PCs.
The final one we've got here is some village children in a marsh or swamp have come across a strange object, and news of it filters to the player characters. Turns out, when they find it, it's a strange egg-shaped thing, and it is in fact a Naga egg. How it ended up where it is, and what's likely to happen if and when the Naga come looking for it, that may well have to wait until Writ of the Wilds arrives. But that could also be up to you. And if you want an extra complication option, it's guarded by a particularly stupid swamp troll who thinks it's a special treasure.
I love it. So I hope that this gave you some ideas for putting marshes and swamps into your stories. At least they are an interesting place to get through. There is a sequence in Crimson Gold Agonies that they all have in a lovely part of the marshes, so you can check that out maybe if you want to listen to some podcasts set in such a place. But I think that's it for us this week.
Okay. So we'd like to give a shout out to our sister podcast and to our patrons, starting with our sister podcast Fortune and Strife, our affiliated actual play podcast, as well as our friends at D20 Radio, who host a huge swathe of RPG content. So do go visit our friends at Fortune and Strife and D20 Radio.
We did want to call out our Patreons. Among our lovely Patreons are Carol F. and Robert L., who names himself Daimyo of Clan Aardvark. So thank you for being Daimyo of Clan Aardvark and being one of our patrons. We appreciate it. And also Diogo Salazar, who is a frequent contributor online to the RPG Discord list. So thank you, Diogo. Appreciate it.
Our content is funded by the Community Discord Patreon, so that pays for editing costs as well as the hosting costs of the podcast and our website, where you can find long-term information, summaries of our podcasts, RPG tools, and more. For our patrons, we have special bonus content like Adventure Seeds, early access to our podcasts, and more. Online, you can find us at our website, courtgamespod.com. On Twitter, we are twitter.com/courtgamespod. And we are on Patreon at patreon.com/courtgames.
But that is it for us. This is Kikita Kaori. May the fortunes favor you.
And I have been Korvar, and until we meet again, keep your jade handy.
Correctly with the correct amount.
D20 Radio, where gamers roll.
www.d20radio.com.